A cold night changes everything for Daniel, a lonely carpenter, when he finds an abandoned girl, Grace, at his doorstep. Driven by a love he never thought he had, he raises the girl as his own daughter. But years later, the revelation that Grace might be the long-lost daughter of a wealthy family threatens to tear apart what God brought together. Can the power of love overcome this test? Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Stay with us until the end, this story might be more surprising than you think. The wind howled like a mournful cry that night. Daniel, a carpenter with calloused hands and a heavy heart, was locking the windows of his small workshop as torrential rain soaked the village. He had lived alone since losing his wife in a tragic accident years ago. Solitude had become his constant companion, and his daily routine held no surprises, until that night. As he prepared to extinguish the lights and retreat to his small home, a strange sound broke the silence. It was a faint cry, almost swallowed by the storm. Daniel paused, frowning. He thought it was his imagination, but the sound persisted, so fragile it felt like a whispered plea for help. Following the sound, Daniel stepped out into the alley behind the workshop, where shadows stretched like reaching arms. Water streamed down the dirt road like tiny rivers, and the dim glow of a single lantern revealed a sight that made him catch his breath. Wrapped in a thin, soaked blanket was a baby girl, no older than a year, crying softly. Daniel hesitated. Who would abandon a child out here in such a merciless storm? He looked around, hoping to find someone, but the street was eerily empty. His instincts screamed at him to pick up the child, yet the weight of his own brokenness and doubts held him back. How could a man as shattered as he was care for a life so delicate? The baby opened her eyes and stared at him, her gaze filled with silent desperation. Something inside Daniel cracked, a call he couldn't ignore, an unspoken reason he felt he was meant to be there. Without further thought, he knelt and scooped the tiny, trembling body into his arms. She was ice cold, shivering uncontrollably, but as soon as she felt the warmth of his chest, her crying softened. Wrapping her in his coat, Daniel hurried back inside. Once in his modest cabin, he lit the fireplace with trembling hands and laid the girl on a dry towel. Her wide, dark eyes studied him curiously, even amidst her frailty. "Who are you, little one? And why did God place you in my path?" Daniel murmured, cradling her gently. He knew his life was about to change, but he couldn't yet fathom the significance of the moment. Outside, the rain continued to pour, but inside, something began to thaw, not just from the fire, but from a spark of hope he hadn't felt in years. As the girl drifted to sleep in his arms, Daniel whispered a silent prayer, "Lord, if this is your will, guide me. I don't know how to care for her, but I know I can't leave her alone." He had no idea what the next day would bring, but he was certain of one thing: this child had found a home, and perhaps, so had he. As Daniel drifted off in the chair beside the fire, holding the girl tightly, a noise echoed at the door. An unexpected visitor in the storm? Or something more? The noise at the door startled Daniel awake. The girl was still asleep in his arms, breathing calmly for the first time since he found her. He stood slowly, careful not to disturb her, and walked cautiously to the door. When he opened it, only the midnight wind greeted him, carrying droplets of rain that scattered across the wooden floor. Daniel glanced in every direction, hoping to see whoever had knocked, but there was no one there. Only the storm's lingering whispers surrounded him. He shut the door and locked it more firmly this time, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at work that night. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the sky painted a pale gray. The girl awoke hungry and restless. Daniel, who had never cared for a child before, improvised with what little he had. He warmed some milk and used a small spoon to feed her. It was clumsy and awkward, but the girl accepted each spoonful eagerly. "Well, it seems you're willing to let me help you, even if I have no idea what I'm doing," he said, smiling for the first time in what felt like years. He decided to name her Grace, inspired by the sense of unearned blessing he felt in finding her. Daniel knew the village wouldn't take long to start asking questions. Though he kept to himself, the townsfolk had a way of knowing everything about everyone. He needed to find a way to explain her presence without fueling unnecessary gossip. When he ventured out to gather supplies, carrying Grace wrapped in a blanket, curious stares began immediately. Mrs. Margareth, the kind woman who ran the local grocery, was the first to speak. "Daniel, who's this little one? I didn't know you had company." He hesitated, feeling the weight of the villagers' eyes on him. "She was left at my door during the storm. I don't know where she came from, but I couldn't leave her out there." Margareth frowned but didn't press him further. Instead, she placed a bag of bread and milk on the counter and added a small cloth doll with a gentle smile. "For her. I think you'll find you need more than you realize." Back at the workshop, Daniel set about preparing his home for Grace. The small cottage, practical and sparsely furnished, wasn't equipped to accommodate a child. Yet, he did his best. He cleaned out the small storage room where he kept extra tools, transforming it into a makeshift bedroom for Grace. Stacking wooden planks, he built a simple crib and covered the mattress with the only clean blanket he owned. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. In the days that followed, Grace began to change the atmosphere of Daniel's home. Despite her small size, her presence was full of life. Her laughter, soft and hesitant at first, shattered the silence that had settled over the house since his wife's passing. Caring for her wasn't a burden, Daniel realized, it was a new purpose. Yet doubts lingered. At night, after Grace had fallen asleep, Daniel would sit in the chair beside her crib and pray. "Lord, I don't know why you chose me to care for her, but I trust you have a plan. Please give me the strength not to fail her." Not everyone in the village accepted the new arrangement without questions. One afternoon, as Daniel hammered planks in the workshop, Pastor William appeared. Known for his stern demeanor, the pastor's expression was a mix of concern and authority. "Daniel," he began, "there are rumors in the village about the child you've taken in. Raising a girl on your own could be challenging. People are curious." Daniel sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. "I know. But what was I supposed to do? Leave her out there that night? My conscience, and my faith, wouldn't allow it." The pastor studied him, then softened his tone. "No one is accusing you of wrongdoing. But if you intend to keep her, you must be prepared for the judgment of others. More importantly, you must be certain this is what God has called you to do." The conversation weighed on Daniel. As days turned into weeks, he realized Grace wasn't just a child he had found, she was a gift. And though he knew challenges lay ahead, he also knew he would do whatever it took to protect and care for her. One evening, as Daniel tucked Grace into bed, there was another knock at the door. This time, the footsteps didn't vanish. When he opened it, a stranger stood on the doorstep, holding an envelope. The man's face was unreadable, but the weight of the moment was palpable. "This is for you," the man said, handing over the envelope. Daniel hesitated, his heart heavy with the unspoken possibilities inside. Was this the answer to where Grace had come from, or a question he wasn't ready to ask? Daniel cautiously opened the door, mindful of Grace sleeping in the room next to his. The man standing before him was tall, clad in a heavy, weather-worn coat, with a scruffy beard that hinted at a life of hardship. He extended an envelope silently, his piercing gaze analyzing Daniel's every move. "Can I help you?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "My name is Caleb," the man finally replied. "I heard you found a child. This envelope might help you understand who she is." Daniel accepted the envelope with trembling hands. The paper felt worn, as if it had been handled many times before it reached him. "Who are you? And how do you know about Grace?" "I have my reasons for being here. Read what's inside, and you'll understand." Without waiting for a response, Caleb turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Daniel with more questions than answers. Back inside, Daniel sat at the table and opened the envelope. Inside, he found a hastily written letter and an old photograph of a baby wrapped in a familiar-looking blanket. The face in the photo was unmistakable: Grace. The letter was brief but chilling. "If you've found this child, know that she is in danger. Protect her at all costs. There are people who will stop at nothing to find her, and not all of them have good intentions. She is special. More than you can imagine." Daniel's heart raced. Who were these people? Why would Grace be in danger? He glanced toward the bedroom where she slept peacefully, a surge of protectiveness tightening in his chest. In the days that followed, Daniel became increasingly vigilant. He refused to let Grace leave the house without him and limited his trips to the village, keeping interactions with others to a minimum. Yet, life with Grace continued to bring moments of joy. Her boundless energy filled the house with laughter and light. Grace loved to follow Daniel around the workshop, watching as he built furniture and crafting small wooden toys just for her. One afternoon, as they played in the yard, Grace picked up a scrap of wood and began mimicking him, hammering lightly on a board with a small mallet. "I want to be just like you, Daddy," she exclaimed, calling him that for the first time. Daniel froze, overwhelmed by the simple but profound word. He smiled, his eyes glistening with emotion. "And you already are better than I could ever hope to be, little one." Despite the deepening bond between them, the looming threat cast a shadow over their happiness. Daniel knew that sooner or later, he would have to uncover the truth about Grace's past, and the people who were looking for her. One quiet afternoon, as Grace played in the yard, a distant sound caught Daniel's attention. He turned toward the gate and spotted a carriage stopped on the road. From inside, a woman dressed in elegant attire stepped out, her gaze fixed on his home with unmistakable determination. Daniel's heart sank. Who was she, and what could she possibly want? Daniel's stomach churned as he watched the woman approach. Her dark blue dress, pristine despite the dust of the road, stood out sharply against the simplicity of the surroundings. With purposeful steps, she stopped at the gate and lifted her eyes to meet his. "Are you Daniel?" she asked, her voice firm yet not unfriendly. He nodded, wiping his hands on a rag from his pocket. "Who's asking?" "My name is Helena Martin." She took a deep breath, as if weighing her next words. "I need to speak with you about the girl in your care." Daniel's heart tightened. "Grace? What about her?" Helena hesitated, but pressed on. "My husband and I lost our daughter, Abigail, about 3 years ago. She was only a few months old when she disappeared, and from what I've heard, Grace could be our child." Her words struck Daniel like lightning. He leaned on the fence for support, struggling to process what she had just said. Everything about Helena, her tone, the glimmer of unshed tears in her eyes, seemed genuine. Still, he couldn't accept the thought that Grace, the little girl he now called his own, might belong to another family. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied firmly. "I found Grace abandoned. There's no way to know if she's the same child." "Maybe," Helena said, her voice softening, "but I can't ignore the possibility. I'm here only to ask for a chance to find out the truth." Daniel felt the weight of her words. He couldn't deny Helena's right to seek answers, but the mere thought of losing Grace filled him with dread. Reluctantly, he agreed to let her meet the girl, but he made his position clear: "Grace is my daughter now. I won't give up what God has placed in my care without a fight." Helena nodded, seemingly understanding his fierce love. "I only want to uncover what happened to Abigail. If Grace truly is my daughter, I promise not to rush into any decisions." When Daniel called Grace, she came running, holding a handful of wildflowers she had just picked. She looked curiously at Helena, then shyly hid behind Daniel's leg. "Who is she, Daddy?" Grace asked, clutching his hand. "A friend," he said gently, keeping his voice calm. "She came to talk about you." Helena crouched down to Grace's level, her eyes misty. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly. "You're very beautiful. What's your name?" "Grace," the girl replied with a shy smile. Helena swallowed hard, visibly moved. "That's a beautiful name." Though the encounter was brief, it left Daniel unsettled. Helena's sincerity seemed genuine, but her arrival had stirred a whirlwind of uncertainty in their home. He knew she wouldn't give up easily, and to protect Grace, he would need strength he wasn't sure he had. That night, as Daniel tucked Grace into bed, he found a small envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a short but chilling message. "Don't trust anyone. Not everything is as it seems." Daniel sat at the table, the small envelope open before him. He read the message over and over, as though trying to extract deeper meaning from the cryptic words, "Don't trust anyone. Not everything is as it seems." The handwriting was firm, almost commanding, but there was no signature or clue as to who might have sent it. His hands were tense, gripping the paper as if it might yield answers under pressure. His thoughts drifted to Caleb, the mysterious man who had delivered the letter days before, and now to Helena, the woman who believed she was Grace's mother. Everything seemed connected, yet the pieces refused to fit. As Daniel's mind swirled with doubts and fears, Grace slept peacefully. He glanced at the small crib he had built for her, her serene face softly lit by the flickering glow of the fireplace. "I'll protect you," he whispered. "No matter what it takes." The next morning, Daniel resolved to face his uncertainties head-on. He brought Grace with him to the village, partly to keep her close from potential threats and partly to seek answers. Stopping at the general store, he was greeted by Mrs. Margaretha's curious smile. "Well, Daniel," she began, "the whole village is buzzing about that elegant visitor you had yesterday." What did she want? Daniel disliked gossip, but he knew the conversation could be useful. "She claims Grace might be the daughter she lost years ago. I'm trying to figure out if there's any truth to it." Margaret paused, thoughtful. "The Martins are a well-known family, you know. They lost their daughter under strange circumstances and never truly recovered. But Daniel, be careful. When it comes to people with money and influence, things are rarely as they seem." Her words echoed the warning in the mysterious letter. Determined to dig deeper, Daniel sought out Pastor William, whose insight into the villagers often extended beyond what he openly shared. "Pastor," Daniel began, what can you tell me about the Martin family?" The pastor adjusted his glasses and sighed. "They're an influential family and, by most accounts, good people. But their daughter's disappearance brought a lot of speculation. Some say it was a kidnapping, others whisper about betrayal within the family. There are even those who believe there was no disappearance at all, only a secret buried deep." The pastor's words only deepened Daniel's suspicions. Could Grace be at the center of something far larger than he'd imagined? That evening, as Daniel returned home, he found Helena waiting at the gate once more. This time, she appeared more resolute. "Daniel," she began, "we've conducted some tests. We need to talk." Reluctantly, Daniel let her in, while Grace played in the yard, blissfully unaware of the growing tension. Helena pulled an envelope from her bag, similar to the one Daniel had received, but its contents were entirely different. "The tests confirmed it," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Grace is my Abigail." Her words struck like a blow. Daniel gripped his chair for support, the ground beneath him seeming to shift. "And now? Are you here to take her from me?" Helena shook her head. "I don't know what to do. I want my daughter back home, but I can't ignore the love you have for her. This is more complicated than I ever imagined." Before Daniel could respond, Grace burst into the room, holding one of her wooden toys. "Daddy, look what I made today." Helena looked at the girl with a mix of love and heartbreak, while Daniel, fighting his own anguish, knelt to embrace her. "It's perfect, sweetheart," he said, his voice trembling. Helena, clutching the envelope with the test results, turned to Daniel and made a proposal he never expected to hear. "What if we find a way to be her family, together?" Helena's proposal lingered in the air, heavy with uncertainty and emotion. Daniel stared at her, grappling with what he had just heard. Share Grace? The thought was unbearable, but he knew that no matter his answer, the final decision might not be entirely his to make. "Do you really believe this could work?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with anger and fear. "Grace isn't something that can just be split between us." Helena tilted her head, her eyes glistening. "I know. But I also know that tearing her away from you now would be cruel. She loves you. That much is clear. I'm just trying to find a solution that won't hurt anyone, though I know that might be impossible." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. Helena seemed genuine, but his instinct to protect Grace at all costs burned fiercely. "I'll think about it," he said at last, his voice laden with hesitation. In the days that followed, tension settled over the house like a shadow. Grace continued to play and laugh, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around her. Daniel spent sleepless nights praying for clarity. He knew he couldn't make this decision alone. He needed guidance and support. One morning, as he worked in the workshop with Grace playing nearby, Caleb appeared again. He looked more worn than before, but his expression was urgent. "You got my letter," Caleb said bluntly. Daniel eyed him with suspicion. "What's going on? Why did you send me that message?" Caleb stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't understand. There's more to this story than you realize. If Grace really is Abigail, it means she has a dangerous past. It's not just the Martins who want her. There are others, people who will stop at nothing to find her." "What kind of people?" Daniel demanded, his pulse quickening. "Powerful ones," Caleb replied. "People who don't see Grace as a child but as a threat, a secret that must be erased." Caleb's words hit Daniel like a blow. He glanced at Grace, who was giggling as she tried to stack wooden blocks. How could anyone see her as anything but the bright, joyful child she was? "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" Daniel asked, his fists clenching. "I want to help," Caleb said. "But you need to be careful. If you choose to share Grace with the Martins, do it cautiously. Don't be fooled by their appearances. Their love for her might be real, but that doesn't mean they're alone in this story." Daniel watched as Caleb walked away once more, the weight of his warning sinking in. He didn't know who to trust, but one thing was clear: he had to protect Grace, no matter the cost. That evening, Daniel went to Pastor William for advice. Sitting on the wooden pews of the empty church, he poured out his heart, the tears he'd been holding back for days finally streaming down his face. "Pastor," he said, his voice breaking, "how can I protect someone I love when it feels like the whole world is trying to take her from me?" William placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Daniel, God never gives us a battle we can't face. Pray for wisdom and make your decision with love, but never lose sight of what's best for Grace. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is letting go." The pastor's words struck deep. Daniel realized he would have to face the Martins again and make a decision that would shape Grace's future forever. The next morning, as Daniel prepared to meet Helena, Grace ran up to him holding a drawing she had made. "Daddy, I made this for you." On the paper was a childlike depiction of her standing between two houses, holding Daniel's hand on one side and Helena's on the other. She looked up at him with an innocent smile and asked, "Do you think we could all be one big family, Daddy?" Daniel looked at Grace's drawing in his hands, feeling the weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. She didn't understand the complexity of the situation, but her innocent vision was as clear as a prayer: she wanted love, not division. He clutched the paper to his chest, fighting back tears. "We'll figure it out, little one," he said, trying to keep the pain out of his voice. "I promise." Hours later, Daniel walked toward the Martins' mansion, Grace holding tightly to his hand. The place was grand, a testament to a wealth Daniel could never offer. Yet as he passed the iron gates and climbed the marble steps, he felt something that no money could buy: the unbreakable bond he and Grace had built. Helena and David Martin stood waiting at the entrance. David, a tall, well-dressed man, seemed less at ease than his wife. It was clear the situation unsettled him, but he managed a kind smile at Grace, who returned it with a shy wave. After a brief silence, they all gathered in a luxurious sitting room, its walls adorned with portraits of generations past. Daniel felt out of place, but Helena got straight to the point. "Daniel, we know this decision isn't easy for any of us. We also know that Grace loves you. She needs you." David chimed in, his gaze sincere as it rested on Daniel. "But as her biological parents, we believe we have a right to be part of her life. We're not here to take your daughter away from you. We're here to build a solution where we can all be part of her life." Daniel, gripping Grace's hand as though it were his lifeline, responded firmly. "Grace is more than a biological connection. I found her when both she and I needed a miracle. Since then, we've been everything to each other. I'm not giving her up." The air grew tense. Helena looked emotional, while David remained quiet, as though weighing Daniel's words. Finally, Helena spoke. "Maybe we don't need to choose one or the other. What if, instead, we work together? Grace could have the best of both worlds. We can give her what we have without taking away what you've built with her." Daniel hesitated. The idea sounded good in theory, but the fear of losing Grace still gnawed at him. Before he could respond, Grace, who had been listening quietly, looked up at them all and said with disarming simplicity, "I love Daddy Daniel, but I like Mommy Helena too. Can I stay with both of you?" The room fell silent, and it was Helena who broke it, her voice trembling as she fought back tears. "You're very wise for your age, sweetheart," she said with a wavering smile. David, sensing the gravity of the moment, extended his hand to Daniel. "We trust you to remain the center of Grace's life. But please, let us be part of it too. We don't want to replace you. We want to join you." Daniel looked at Grace, who stared back with wide, hopeful eyes. As much as it hurt to relinquish a part of his exclusivity, he knew what he had to do. With a hesitant handshake, he sealed the agreement. "For her," Daniel said, his voice heavy with emotion. "For Grace, I'll do it." As Daniel and Grace walked home, she clutched her drawing tightly. But as night fell, a shadow moved near the roadside. On the other side of the fence, Caleb watched from a distance, his face grim as he murmured to himself, "This isn't over. They need to know the truth." The days that followed were full of adjustments. The agreement between Daniel and the Martins seemed feasible in theory, but reality was proving more complicated. Grace, with her boundless joy, adapted easily, splitting her time between the two homes. For her, every visit to the Martins' mansion was an adventure: new clothes, luxurious toys, and meals that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. Yet, each time she returned to Daniel, her eyes sparkled with excitement as she eagerly shared her latest drawings or recounted her stories. Daniel, however, wrestled with a nagging insecurity. Would the comfort and wealth of the Martins draw Grace away from the simple life they had built together? He knew the thought was selfish, but it clung to him all the same. One day, while Daniel was working in his workshop, Caleb appeared again. This time, there were no cryptic letters or veiled warnings. Caleb simply sat on a nearby bench, watching Daniel hammer a plank in silence. "Do you really think this is going to work?" Caleb finally asked. Daniel paused, setting his tools down. "I don't know. But I'm trying to do what's best for Grace." Caleb sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if summoning the courage to speak. "There's something you need to know. Something that could change everything." "Again, Caleb?" Daniel replied, his frustration boiling over. "You show up, drop your doubts, and then vanish. Either tell me what you know right now, or don't say anything at all." Caleb nodded slowly. "All right. Here's the truth: Grace didn't just disappear from the Martins' home. She was taken. And not by strangers, by someone close to the family." Daniel froze, his mind racing. "Taken? Why?" "Because she was in danger," Caleb said, lowering his voice. "There are secrets in the Martin family that you can't begin to imagine. Secrets that could put Grace at risk. The person who took her was trying to protect her." Daniel stood, staring Caleb down. "And do you know who that person was?" Caleb hesitated before answering. "Yes. But that's not what matters right now. What matters is that Grace is still in danger. You need to stay vigilant." Before Daniel could press him for more, Caleb stood and left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving behind a storm of anger and fear swirling in Daniel's mind. That evening, during the Martins' first visit to Daniel's humble cabin for dinner, he watched their every move, every word. Despite his doubts, he saw nothing but love in Helena's eyes as she played with Grace, and no trace of deceit in David's voice as he spoke of his hopes for the girl's future. But Caleb's warning lingered in Daniel's mind, a dark cloud he couldn't shake. Later that night, as Daniel washed the dishes after the meal, something caught his eye, a crumpled piece of paper wedged in the corner of the window. His heart pounding, he unfolded it and found a short message written in the familiar firm handwriting. "The danger is closer than you think." Daniel clutched the note tightly, his eyes fixed on the words that seemed to whisper danger with every letter. He glanced out the window, but the night was still, devoid of any movement. Who had left the note? And what did it mean that the danger was closer than he thought? He slipped the note into his pocket, resolving not to let his fears overshadow Grace's night. Returning to the living room, he found Helena and David sitting near the fireplace, watching Grace play with one of her wooden toys. The scene was so serene that it almost convinced him everything was fine. Almost. That night, after the Martins had left, Daniel tucked Grace into bed. As he watched her sleep, the note seemed to grow heavier in his pocket. He knew he couldn't ignore the warning, but he also couldn't let fear dictate his actions. In the weeks that followed, the routine between the two families began to settle. Helena and David frequently visited Daniel, making a visible effort to respect his role in Grace's life. The little girl thrived with the affection of both families, though her deep attachment to Daniel was undeniable. Yet signs that something was wrong persisted. Daniel began to notice subtle but troubling details, a carriage lingering too long on the road, a stranger seemingly watching his home from a distance, and, more than once, the eerie feeling that he was being followed. One day, while walking with Grace through the village, Daniel spotted a familiar figure among the market stalls, Caleb. The man stood still, pretending to examine goods, but his sharp eyes followed Daniel and Grace. Without hesitation, Daniel approached him. "Caleb," he said firmly, "you told me you knew who took Grace from the Martins' home. I need the truth now." Caleb glanced around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. "The person who took her did so to protect her. But that's not the threat now. The Martins have enemies, Daniel. People who know their secrets and could use Grace to hurt them." "What secrets?" Daniel demanded, his voice low but unyielding. Caleb shook his head. "I can't say. Not yet. But know this, you made a deal with them without knowing the full story. And that could cost you." Daniel grabbed Caleb's arm, his gaze intense. "If Grace is in danger, tell me who, or what, I'm up against." Caleb stared back for a long moment before whispering, "The danger isn't from the outside, Daniel. It's from within." Before Daniel could press him further, Caleb pulled free and vanished into the crowd. That night, as Daniel prepared for bed, he heard Grace crying. Rushing to her room, he found her trembling in her bed. "I had a bad dream, Daddy," she said, tears streaming down her face. "A strange woman took me away and said I couldn't stay with you." Daniel's heart clenched, but before he could comfort her, a noise froze him in place, a sound from outside. Footsteps. On the porch. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door, his heart racing. The beam swept across the porch, but there was no one in sight. The night was still, save for the whisper of wind rustling through the trees around the house. He stepped outside, gripping the flashlight tightly, but all he found was a faint mark on the ground, as if someone had stood there for a while. With the note still heavy in his pocket and Caleb's words echoing in his mind, Daniel returned inside. Grace was sitting up in bed, clutching her blanket tightly. He walked over and pulled her into his arms. "It was just a dream, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice steady. "I'm here. No one's going to take you away from me." Grace hugged him tightly, and in that moment, Daniel knew he would do anything to protect her, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths. The next morning, Helena and David arrived unexpectedly at the house. Helena's expression was serious, while David appeared more uncomfortable than usual. "Daniel, we need to talk," Helena said, getting straight to the point. "We received an anonymous message. Someone is threatening us." She handed Daniel a letter that had been delivered to the Martins' mansion that morning. The message was short but chilling. "If you don't want the truth about Grace to come out, stay away from her." Daniel felt a surge of anger. "Who's doing this? And why is everyone keeping me in the dark?" David, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "There are things in our family's past, choices we made, that could hurt Grace if they come to light. We didn't want to involve you, but it seems we don't have a choice anymore." Helena continued, her voice trembling slightly. "When Grace was born, our marriage was falling apart. David had a relationship outside the marriage. When Abigail disappeared, when Grace disappeared, we believed it was retaliation, but we could never prove it." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. "So, you think someone close to you took Grace? Out of revenge?" Helena nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "We don't know who, but it seems whoever it was is still around." As the conversation continued, Grace played in the yard, blissfully unaware of the tension in the room. Daniel glanced out the window at her laughter drifting inside, and he knew he had to resolve this before it touched her innocent world. He turned to Helena and David. "If we're going to protect Grace, we have to do it together. No secrets. No half-truths." Helena nodded, but before she could reply, Grace came running into the house, holding something small in her hands. "Daddy, look. I found this near the fence." It was a ring, engraved with a crest that Daniel didn't recognize, but Helena's face went pale the moment she saw it. "That ring, it's from our family," she whispered. "It belonged to someone who used to work for us." Before they could investigate further, a firm knock sounded at the door. Daniel opened it to find Caleb standing there, his face marked with urgency. "They know where Grace is," Caleb said. "And they're coming." Caleb's warning plunged the room into a heightened state of fear. Daniel glanced at Helena and David, who were just as alarmed as he was, but their expressions carried an undertone of confusion. Who were they? And why was Grace the target? Caleb stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closing the door quickly behind him. "We don't have much time," he said, looking directly at Daniel. "They're planning to take Grace tonight. We need to get her out of here now." Helena stood, her voice sharp and demanding. "Who's coming? Why is my daughter in danger? You need to explain." Caleb met her gaze, as if weighing how much he could reveal. "The ring Grace found? It belongs to someone who used to work for your family. Someone who knew too much." "James," David said suddenly, his voice filled with disbelief. "He was the driver. We let him go around the time Abigail disappeared. Are you saying he's involved?" Caleb nodded grimly. "James knew things that could destroy your family. He wasn't alone, either. When Grace went missing, he used that to build leverage, a web of blackmail against you. When that failed, he vanished. Now he's back." Daniel, who had been silently absorbing the conversation, finally spoke. "What does that have to do with Grace now? Why would he still want her?" Caleb glanced at Grace, sitting in the corner playing with her doll, blissfully unaware of the tension in the room. "Because she's the last piece he can use to exact revenge," She's the key to exposing secrets that could ruin everything you have. Helena went pale, and David looked ready to protest, but Daniel cut through the tension. Kneeling before Grace, he took her small hands in his own. "Sweetheart, we're going on a little trip, all right? Think of it as an adventure." Grace beamed with excitement. "With you and Mommy Helena?" "Yes," Daniel said, masking the urgency in his voice. "All of us together." As Caleb hastily outlined their plan, the atmosphere in the house was thick with tension. They agreed to take Grace to a secluded cabin on the outskirts of the village, a place where she could be kept safe while they figured out James's next move. Night fell quickly, and the small group left Daniel's house, Grace asleep in his arms. Helena's carriage, though modest, blended well enough into the darkened roads, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that every shadow along the way held unseen eyes. When they finally reached the cabin, Caleb stepped out first to inspect the place. He approached the door cautiously, scanning the perimeter before unlocking it. As he entered, he froze in his tracks. On the center of the table was a single note, pinned in place by a knife. The message read, "You're late. I'm closer than you think." The note on the table left everyone silent. Daniel clutched Grace tightly to his chest, while Helena and David exchanged fearful glances. Caleb, his face grim, turned slowly toward the group. "He was here," Caleb said, his voice low but charged with urgency. "He's tracking us. We're not as safe as we thought." Daniel took a deep breath, fighting to stay calm. The last thing Grace needed was to see the fear in his eyes. Though still drowsy, she noticed the tension around her. "Daddy, what's going on?" "It's all right, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "We just need to rest here for a little while." Caleb approached Daniel, speaking in a hushed tone. "You need to stay sharp. If James left this note, it's because he wants us to know he's in control. He's trying to make you surrender without a fight." Daniel's expression hardened, his resolve solidifying. "I won't surrender." "He's not taking Grace." The night crawled by. Helena kept Grace occupied with soothing stories, while David and Caleb debated strategies. The tension in the cabin was almost suffocating, broken only by the sudden sound of footsteps crunching on dry leaves outside. Everyone froze. Daniel stood, gripping a heavy carpentry tool he had brought with him. Caleb motioned for him to stay back. "Let me handle this. I'll see who it is." Caleb slipped out the door, closing it quietly behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's heart raced as Grace huddled close to Helena, her small hands trembling. Then, a scream shattered the stillness. Daniel bolted to the door and flung it open. Caleb lay on the ground, clutching his arm, blood seeping through a deep gash. Standing in the shadow of the trees was a tall, hooded man, his menacing silhouette illuminated by the pale moonlight. "James!" David called out, his voice filled with recognition and dread. The man stepped forward, pulling back his hood. His face was sharp and cold, his eyes a storm of anger and determination. "At last," he said, his voice steady and icy. "We meet. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here for what's mine." Daniel moved in front of Grace, shielding her with his body. "She's not yours. You took her from her family and left her to die. What do you really want?" James laughed bitterly. "I saved her. She's the symbol of everything taken from me. And now, I'm going to finish what I started." Before he could advance, Caleb, despite his injury, struggled to his feet and stood between James and the cabin. "You'll have to go through me first." James hesitated, his eyes darting between the group. "You think you can stop me? This isn't a fight you can win." Daniel tightened his grip on the tool in his hand, prepared to defend Grace no matter the cost. But before the situation could escalate further, Helena stepped forward, her voice sharp and commanding. "James," she said, cutting through the tension. "If it's revenge you want, you won't find it through an innocent child. If you have a grudge against me or David, face us. Leave Grace out of this." James laughed again, this time with a dark, chilling tone. "It's too late for negotiations." He took another step forward, but before he could move further, the sound of horses echoed through the forest. Lights flickered among the trees, villagers, led by Pastor William, carrying torches and tools. The pastor's voice rang out with authority. "You won't harm anyone here tonight." Realizing he was outnumbered, James shot a final, piercing glance at Grace, who was peeking out from behind Daniel, before retreating into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared. Though James had fled, Caleb turned to Daniel, his face etched with concern. "This isn't over. He'll be back, and next time, he'll be ready." The tension in the cabin lingered even after James had fled. The villagers, led by Pastor William, encircled the cabin, determined to ensure no one else could approach. Caleb, injured but refusing to rest, insisted everyone understand the gravity of the situation. "He's not going to stop," Caleb said as Helena tended to the gash on his arm. "James isn't just a man seeking revenge. He's calculating, and everything he does serves a purpose. He knows what Grace represents." Daniel, exhausted but still on edge, stepped closer to Caleb. "You said Grace represents something. Something bigger. Stop keeping things from me. What does she mean to him?" Caleb glanced at Helena and David, who looked just as baffled as Daniel. With a heavy sigh, he began to explain. "When Grace was born, she wasn't just an heir. She was the keystone of a secret agreement, an agreement David made with people he should have never involved." David shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and shame. "This has nothing to do with Grace. It's my fault, and mine alone." Helena stared at him, her voice shaking. "David, what did you do?" Lowering his head, David spoke haltingly, his voice heavy with regret. "When Abigail was born, I was in financial trouble. I made a deal with James, who was involved in questionable dealings. In exchange for money to keep our properties afloat, he demanded influence over our family, a kind of alliance. When his schemes were uncovered, I had to fire him. I thought it ended there." Caleb interjected. "It didn't. When James realized his position with the family was slipping, he used Grace, or Abigail, as she was known, as leverage. He took her to ensure you would never break the terms of the deal." Helena covered her face, tears streaming down. "You knew this? You knew why she disappeared and never told me?" David shook his head vehemently. "I didn't know he had taken her. I thought it was someone else, a random crime. When you fell into depression, I didn't have the courage to tell you about James. I tried to bury it all." Daniel stood silently, his anger boiling inside. "So all of this is because of your greed and dishonesty?" He glanced at Grace, who had fallen asleep on the sofa, blissfully unaware of the chaos around her. "She shouldn't have to bear the weight of your mistakes." Pastor William, who had been listening quietly to David's confession, stepped forward. The truth is finally out, but what matters now is protecting this child. What James wants isn't just revenge. He wants control. And as long as there are shadows of these secrets, he'll exploit them. Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. If James is coming for Grace, he won't find her defenseless. She has me. And now she has all of you. Helena wiped her tears and lifted her chin with renewed determination. We need to face this together. And we need to stop James before he destroys everything. As they began forming a plan to protect Grace, a scream pierced the air outside the cabin. One of the villagers stationed as a lookout came running toward the door, breathless and panicked. He's here. James is coming, with armed men. The lookout screamed through the cabin into chaos. Daniel rushed to Grace, who had woken up startled by the commotion. He scooped her into his arms, holding her tightly. It's okay, sweetheart, he whispered. I won't let anyone hurt you. Helena and David exchanged anxious glances, while Caleb, despite his injury, gripped an improvised weapon, a heavy wooden club. Outside, Pastor William and the gathered villagers readied themselves with whatever they could find, axes, pitchforks, and torches. He doesn't just want Grace, Caleb muttered, his eyes fixed on the dark tree line beyond the cabin. He wants to show everyone that he's untouchable. The sound of approaching horses and footsteps grew louder. The flickering glow of torches cut through the forest shadows, and soon James appeared at the front of a group of men. His face bore a cold, confident smile, as though victory was already in his grasp. You really think you can stop me? James called out, his voice ringing through the trees. That girl belongs to me. To me, and to everything you've tried to hide. Daniel stepped forward, still holding Grace protectively. You have no right to her, James. None. She isn't some pawn or a piece in your sick game. Grace is my daughter, mine, and theirs. And we're not giving her to you. James chuckled, but his eyes were dark with malice. Brave words, carpenter. Admirable, even. But bravery won't be enough. He gestured sharply, and his men began to advance. The villagers, led by Pastor William, formed a protective barrier around the cabin, ready to defend Grace with their lives. The air grew thick with tension, the imminent clash a storm waiting to break. Helena stepped forward suddenly, placing herself just a few feet from James. If you want revenge, take it out on me, she said, her voice steady yet full of emotion. I trusted David. I let all of this happen. But Grace has nothing to do with your mistakes, or ours. James hesitated, her words striking something within him. But the pause was brief. His gaze fixed on Grace, still nestled in Daniel's arms. She's the symbol of everything I lost. And I won't leave without her. Before James could issue another command, Caleb stepped forward, injured but resolute. You'll never win, James. Because unlike you, this village knows what unity is. What love is. James's smile faltered as he took in the determined villagers surrounding the cabin. Ordinary people, armed with little more than farm tools and courage, stood steadfast against him and his men. From the woods, more footsteps echoed, additional villagers arriving, armed with makeshift weapons to strengthen the defense. Realizing he couldn't win without provoking a disaster, James took a step back. His confidence began to crack as he surveyed the growing force of resistance. This isn't over, he muttered, before signaling his men to retreat. As James and his men disappeared into the darkness, a wave of relief swept through the cabin, though no one dared to relax completely. Later that night, as Grace dozed off again in Daniel's arms, Caleb pulled him aside. "This was just the beginning," Caleb warned. "James may have retreated, but he still has allies. The only way to stop him for good is to expose everything he knows, all the secrets." "Are you ready for that, Daniel? Because the truth could change everything." Caleb's words were hard to process, but Daniel knew there was no turning back. He turned to him, his voice resolute. "No more half-truths. Tell me everything you know." Caleb glanced at the tense faces around him, pausing briefly on Helena and David. Taking a deep breath, he began. "James has information that could ruin you, not just out of revenge, but because he sees Grace as the embodiment of everything he lost. He knows that if he exposes the Martins' secrets, he'll hold power over you forever." David stepped forward, his expression stiff. "None of those secrets are about Grace," he said firmly. "She's innocent in all of this." "It's not that simple," Caleb replied. "James knows that Grace's existence is directly tied to your decision to cut him off. When he was pushed out, Grace was the reason you finalized your break from him." Helena's brow furrowed, confusion clear in her face. "Cut ties? What are you talking about?" David closed his eyes, his face etched with guilt. At last, he spoke, his voice heavy. "Helena, there's something I never told you. When Grace was born, James used the occasion to try to force me into renewing our agreement. He threatened to expose old family secrets that would destroy the Martins' name forever. I knew that if I agreed, all of us would be at risk. So, I refused. But James didn't take it well. When Grace disappeared, I thought it was retaliation, but I never understood the depth of his hatred until now." Helena shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "You lied to me. You let me believe it was my fault we lost Grace, that it was some random tragedy, when all of this was tied to your past with James." "Helena," David said, stepping closer to her, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Why didn't you tell me?" she cried, her voice breaking. "Grace is my daughter too." "I was trying to protect you both," he said, his pain evident. "I thought I could fix everything on my own. I failed." Daniel, who had been listening silently, finally spoke up, his tone cutting through the tension. "If you stay stuck in the past, James wins. The only thing that matters now is protecting Grace. She's not a symbol, or some pawn in a game. She's a child who deserves peace." Helena wiped her tears and lifted her chin. "You're right. Grace needs us. We have to face James together, with no more secrets." Caleb nodded in agreement. "James only has power because you fear the secrets he holds. If we expose everything ourselves, he loses his leverage." David hesitated, looking around at the group. "But what if he uses Grace to drag our family through the mud?" Helena placed a steady hand on David's shoulder. "If he does, we'll face the consequences. But he won't take our daughter from us again." Before they could decide their next move, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the cabin. James's cold, calculated voice pierced the silence. "So much courage in your words. Let's see if you have the same strength to face the truth head-on." James's footsteps grew louder, crunching dry leaves as he moved toward the cabin. Everyone inside froze, the air heavy with tension. Daniel instinctively positioned Grace behind him, his eyes locked on the door. Caleb, still visibly injured, grabbed a nearby piece of wood, ready to act if needed. Helena clutched David's arm, who seemed caught between guilt and anger. The door creaked open slowly, as if prolonging the moment. James appeared, alone, a cruel smile etched across his face. He held a torch in one hand and an envelope in the other.
"Ah,
What a touching reunion," he sneered. "The family together. But are you ready to hear what you really have in common?" "Cut the games, James," Daniel said, stepping forward. "If you came all the way here, just say what you want." James smiled smugly, holding up the envelope. "This contains all the evidence I need to ruin the Martins. Dirty deals, broken alliances, secrets you've kept from the village, from everyone. You can play saints, but I know the truth." Helena stepped forward, defiant. "Go ahead, ruin our name, James. Expose us. But you won't take Grace from us." James laughed. "Oh, Helena, always so brave. But do you really think this little display of courage will stop me? I don't need Grace as a daughter. I need her as a living reminder of everything you took from me. Of all the power I lost because of you." Caleb raised the piece of wood toward James. "You talk about power like it's something that can fill the emptiness inside you. But what you're trying to do is destroy a child just to ease your own misery." James ignored Caleb, turning his gaze to Daniel. "And you, carpenter? What do you think of all this? Do you believe you're more of a father to that girl than they are?" Daniel took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "I don't believe it. I know it. And it has nothing to do with where she was born or where she came from. It's because she knows where her home is. And it's not with you." For a moment, something flickered in James's eyes. Perhaps a trace of doubt or a memory of the man he might have been. But the moment passed quickly. He tossed the envelope to the floor and turned to leave, calling over his shoulder, "This isn't over. I'll be back, and next time, I won't be alone." As James vanished into the darkness, Daniel picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside were documents and an old photograph of Grace as a baby. But behind it, something no one expected, a letter written by Grace's biological mother. "She deserves to be loved by those who truly care. Protect my daughter, for one day, someone will come to claim her." Daniel stared at the letter, the words etched in careful handwriting carrying a profound weight. "She deserves to be loved by those who truly care. Protect my daughter, for one day someone will come to claim her." Helena and David, standing beside Daniel, leaned in to read it. Helena clutched her chest, her breath unsteady. This was written by Grace's biological mother? David shook his head, confusion etched on his face. If James took Grace from us, how did he get this letter? And what did she mean by claim her? Caleb, watching the scene intently, took the letter from Daniel's hands. "This explains a lot," he said thoughtfully. "James must have used this letter to justify his actions. To him, claiming Grace is about proving his dominance, showing no one can defy him." But Daniel's focus was elsewhere. He flipped the letter over and noticed something in the bottom corner, a name signed in delicate script, Eleanor. "Eleanor?" Daniel murmured. "Who is she?" Helena and David exchanged glances, a shadow of recognition passing between them. David's expression hardened. "Eleanor was a close friend of the family," Helena explained. "She worked for us as a governess, but she was more than that, practically family. She disappeared shortly after Grace was taken. We never knew what happened to her." Caleb frowned, the pieces falling into place. "This changes everything. If Eleanor wrote this letter, it's possible she didn't take Grace out of hatred or revenge but to protect her. James might have twisted the truth to make it look like he was behind it all. Daniel felt the gravity of the revelation. Eleanor, someone he had never met, had risked everything to save Grace. It felt like fate, or perhaps something more, had brought Grace to him. Helena grasped Daniel's arm, her voice trembling with emotion. If Eleanor protected Grace and somehow delivered her into the world, then in a way, she delivered her to you. That has to mean something, Daniel. He nodded slowly. It means I can't fail her. Whatever the whole truth is, whatever James has planned, we need to be ready. Before they could discuss their next steps, a sound broke the stillness, a snap of branches outside the cabin. The tension returned instantly, and Daniel grabbed a lantern as he moved cautiously toward the door. When he opened it, the sight surprised him. A small wooden cross lay on the porch, a red ribbon tied neatly around it. Daniel stared at the object, uncertain. Another cryptic message? A warning? Or perhaps a sign from someone unexpected? Daniel held the small wooden cross carefully, the red ribbon fluttering lightly in the breeze. Its simplicity belied the weight it seemed to carry. Helena and David joined him at the door, their expressions filled with concern. "What is that, Daniel?" Helena asked, holding Grace's hand protectively. "It looks like a message," he replied in a low voice. "But from who, and what does it mean?" Caleb emerged behind them, his watchful eyes scanning the forest edge for movement. Taking the cross from Daniel's hand, he ran his fingers over the weathered wood. "This ribbon, it's a symbol. I've seen it before." "From whom?" Daniel asked. "Eleanor," Caleb said firmly. "She used red ribbons to mark important things, objects or places that needed attention. If this was left here, it might be a clue." Helena's brow furrowed as she struggled to remember. Eleanor used to leave small signs around the estate. But if this was left here now, how could she be involved? She disappeared years ago. Caleb shrugged, his expression grim. Maybe someone else is using her symbols to communicate. Or maybe she never truly disappeared. Daniel glanced at Grace, who was staring at the cross with innocent curiosity. "Whatever this means, we can't ignore it. Someone's trying to tell us something." Caleb nodded, handing the cross back to Daniel. "There's a small clearing in the woods behind the old Martin estate," he said. "Eleanor used to spend a lot of time there, tending to a hidden garden. It might be a good place to start looking for answers." Helena hesitated but finally agreed. "If there's any chance of understanding what really happened to Eleanor and Grace, we have to go." The next morning, the group set out toward the clearing. Caleb led the way, while Daniel, Helena, and David stayed close to Grace, their senses heightened for any signs of danger. The dense woods were eerily silent, their shadows seeming to guard long-buried secrets. After a long, tiring trek, they reached the clearing. At its center was an overgrown garden, flowers wilted and weeds overtaking the space. But something stood out to Daniel. Another wooden cross, identical to the one they had found at the cabin, was embedded in the ground, marking what appeared to be a buried wooden box. "This is it," Caleb said, kneeling to dig up the box. Inside, they found an old diary, its pages yellowed with age and a red ribbon marking a specific entry. Daniel opened it cautiously, reading the first few lines aloud. "If you've found this, it means Grace is alive and safe. I did what I had to do to protect her. But now, the truth must come to light." Helena placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, and together they continued reading. The diary revealed Eleanor's story, how she had uncovered James's plans to use Grace as a bargaining chip, how she had decided to take Grace from the mansion, and how she had hidden her in the village, hoping that someone kind-hearted would find and protect her. "She knew I'd find her," Daniel murmured, his voice thick with emotion. But the diary also contained a final warning: James is not the only threat. There are others who know about Grace and what she represents. If you want to protect her, you'll have to face more than him. You'll need to expose the truth to the world. As they finished reading, the distant sound of horses echoed through the forest. Alarmed, the group turned to see a larger force approaching. At the center of the riders sat James, his expression steely and resolute. "Enough secrets," he shouted, his voice cutting through the clearing. "Hand over Grace, or no one leaves here alive." The sound of hooves echoed like a grim warning through the clearing. James dismounted his horse, followed by a group of armed men forming a semicircle around Daniel, Helena, David, and Caleb. The tension was palpable, and Daniel instinctively placed Grace behind him. "You've found the diary, haven't you?" James said, his cruel smile illuminated by the faint light of dawn. "Now you understand that Grace doesn't belong to any of you. She's my key, my revenge, my leverage over everything that was taken from me." Helena stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "You think you can use a child as a weapon? That's not power, James. That's cowardice." James laughed, a cold and empty sound. "You'll never understand what it's like to lose everything, Helena. But perhaps now you're about to find out." Sensing the imminent danger, Daniel raised his voice. "You've already lost, James. Grace doesn't belong to you. And no matter how much you try to intimidate us, we'll never let you take her." James signaled to his men, who stepped forward with knives and clubs in hand. The confrontation seemed inevitable, but before they could attack, the sound of voices rang out through the forest. "Enough!" The villagers emerged from the trees, led by Pastor William and others armed with tools and torches. They were outnumbered, but their determination was unmistakable. "James," the pastor said, his voice authoritative, "you have no power here. This village protects its own, and Grace is one of us. If you want her, you'll have to go through all of us." James hesitated, his eyes scanning the situation. He realized that even with his men, victory would come at too great a cost. But his pride wouldn't let him retreat so easily. "You think you can stop me," he said defiantly. "If Grace isn't mine, then no one will have her." Before he could act, Caleb stepped forward, facing James directly. "You had your chance to change, James. Now you'll face the consequences of your actions." The clash was swift and intense. The villagers banded together to disarm James's men, while Caleb and Daniel confronted James himself. Fueled by rage, James fought fiercely, but his anger clouded his judgment. Caleb managed to overpower him, pinning him to the ground. "It's over, James," Caleb said, breathing heavily. Defeated, James glanced at Grace, who watched from a safe distance, protected by Helena and David. For a moment, his expression softened, but the flicker of humanity quickly vanished, replaced by his familiar mask of disdain. "You haven't won," he muttered before being taken away by the villagers to face justice. Daniel held Grace tightly in his arms, the weight of their victory mingling with the gravity of what they had endured. Helena and David approached him, their gratitude and emotion evident. "She's our daughter," Helena said firmly. "But she's also yours, Daniel. And she always will be." Months later, life began to settle. James was brought to justice, and the secrets of the Martin family were revealed. To everyone's surprise, the village received the truth with compassion, recognizing Helena and David's efforts to make amends for their mistakes. Grace continued to split her time between the Martins' mansion and Daniel's simple home, now with a clear understanding that she was deeply loved by both families. "Daddy, can I help with the wood today?" she asked, holding a small hammer as she watched Daniel in his workshop. "Of course, little one," he replied with a smile, feeling the warmth of a life he had never imagined. Helena and David often visited Daniel, and together they celebrated Grace's milestones, cherishing the miracle of finding an unexpected family amidst so much pain. On Grace's birthday, the entire village gathered in the town square for a celebration. The joy in her eyes was a testament to the power of love and unity that had prevailed. As Daniel watched Grace play with the other children, his heart felt light. He knew her future was secure, surrounded by people who loved her fiercely. The small wooden cross, now hanging in Daniel's workshop, served as a constant reminder of Eleanor's sacrifice and the courage of everyone who had fought to protect Grace. If this story moved you, tell us, what was the most impactful moment for you? Do you believe love has the power to overcome any adversity, as it did for Grace and her family? Leave your comment, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. This is Narratives That Embrace. Stay blessed, and we'll see you in the next story.